Hey, Ross here again. If you can tell, I've been publishing all the abnormal psychology videos as fast as possible because there's so many of them. I just kind of want to get it over with. And this is the last one in the chapter. It's about obsessive compulsive disorders. Once again, a reminder for your A2 level in Cambridge Psychology, please do not rely on your textbook and do not rely on my video. You have to read far beyond that. You should, look up the words that you don't understand online, look for good psychological resources. Also, make sure you read the actual studies themselves to get a fuller understanding, right? That'll be the best way to study for the exam, right? Okay, so first of all, what is OCD? Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. We often just call it OCD. What is it? Think about it for a second. I'm sure you've heard of this word before, right? A lot of times we see it pop up in popular culture. Sometimes you might even see people using it as an insult, right? Hey, why are you so OCD, right? What do you think about that? What is OCD? Right, so we're going to look at it in a bit more detail. Of course, in my class, I actually do invite guest speakers who have OCD or other disorders to come and speak to my students about it. And there was one of my guests, a girl. I won't reveal her name. Let's say her name is Amanda, and she talked about her experience with OCD and the therapy that she went for and the things that helped her. And oftentimes my students do ask questions like, how do you feel when people talk about OCD casually or when you see it portrayed in the media? How do you feel? And she said that, it's obviously it's not nice to use an official disorder as a joke or as an insult to people, right? Why are you so OCD? Don't be so OCD, right? Although we might say it casually, it is an actual disorder, right? And people do suffer with it. So we should be sensitive when using these kinds of terms, right? And I agree. So let's look at some of the characteristics of obsessive compulsive disorder. Okay, we're going to look at OCD in general as well as two specific disorders in this called Hoarding Disorder and BDD, which stands for Body Dysmorphic Disorder, right? So OCD has two main components, right? The obsessive and the compulsive, right? As the name suggests, obsessive compulsive disorder. They're two very similar words, but they do have a difference. Okay, the difference is this. When you talk about an obsession, right, you talk about an intrusive and recurrent thought, right? This is to do with your thinking, right? You're obsessed, like you can even use the word normally, right? I'm obsessed with this celebrity. I'm obsessed with this type of food. I'm obsessed with this guy or with this girl, right? You keep thinking about that person or that thing, right? And it's very intrusive. Like throughout your day, you just keep thinking about it, right? It's very obsessive. Right, compulsive is a repetitive ritual, right? It's a kind of behavior, right? And repetitive means you do it over and over and over and over and over again, right? So just keep that in mind. The obsessive part is about the thinking. The compulsion or the compulsive part is always about the behavior, right? It's about the behavior. Okay, now why do people do these repetitive behaviors? The purpose behind them is to suppress the thoughts or to reduce anxiety. So you must understand what's happening here is that a person is having an obsessive thought. That obsessive thought is intruding in their mind and having these recurring thoughts. And in order to help them control that, they do the repetitive behaviors to try and kind of like suppress the thoughts or to reduce the anxiety they feel because of these intrusive thoughts, right? So it starts from the thinking, then it results in the behavior, and the behavior is to try and control that, that kind of intrusive thinking, right? Okay, so I had a friend who I asked a question about this online, and he believes he has a mild OCD symptom. So this is a question. I asked him a few questions to describe what he felt his symptom was like, and this is what it sounds like. And you can read this together and you can decide for yourself. Okay, so he said, I have these crazy tendencies to always have to check if I locked my car or house door. Once I took the train to work and halfway got worried and had to take the train all the way back, 30 minutes round trip, to check if my car was locked or not. Similar things happen after I've left the house. I need to check if I locked it, but usually I shove those fears away, but it's always in the back of my mind. So look at what he's talking about. He's talking about two experiences, right? So one of them is whether or not he locked his car, right? And in fact, he could have been late for work, right? Perhaps, by taking a 30-minute round trip on the train back to his car, right? Just to check whether he locked the door, right? And of course, now it's perfect, in most cases, actually you'll find that, most of the time we actually do lock our doors, especially the times when we think we forgot, but actually we do, right? Most of the times, if it's happened to me, most of the times I've actually locked my door. But this can be a problem if every day when he goes to work, he has to always take the train on a 30-minute round trip back to check whether he locked his door, right? So that can be a problem with his work. He also said, very interestingly, that it happens when he locks the door of the house, but he always needs to check. And he says the fears, he shoves them away. So he tries to suppress his fear, but it's always at the back of his mind. Now that's interesting. Right? It's always at the back of his mind, playing on him. So that's the intrusive thoughts part, right? It's there to come as a recurring thought, and then he has to go and do some kind of compulsive checking behavior to make sure, that things are the way they are. The real weird part that makes me realize I have a dash is I need to even out how I physically feel. Example, if my left cheek gets slapped, I need to slap my right cheek. If my right leg gets tapped, I need to tap my left leg too. But if you tap my left leg, I need to tap my right leg right, like my right leg right, but that's not going from left to right once. So the feeling of getting tapped is more recent on the right leg. So I need to on tap again on the right leg, and then the left leg again, so the left leg feels more recent, but then my right leg feels awkward again. What I've discovered over the years is that I finally get comfortable if I tap in this sequence. I'll start with left, but if I start with right, it's just the opposite lah. Left to right, right to left, right to left, left to right. So he needs to, as you can see, he's got this complex compulsive behavior that he has to do to feel comfortable. Right? He feels very uncomfortable if it's just one side of his leg being tapped. He feels he needs to balance it out. There needs to be some kind of symmetry. And if you can look at the way he typed it out, left, right, left, and left, right. So there is a symmetry there, right? It's not just tapping leg lah. It's anything like pulling my ear, tapping my thumb on the steering wheel, etc., etc. I tried resisting the urges, but I feel very uncomfortable, right? So again, he's trying to stop himself from doing the compulsive behavior, but he feels uncomfortable. Why? Because the thought is always in his head. Only after he does the compulsive behavior, then it eases his mind, right? He has to do it in order to feel comfortable. Then he corrected himself. He said, it's actually left, right, right, left, left, right, left, right, right, left. It's much longer. Exclamation mark, right? So he corrected himself. I won't reveal his name. His name, let's just say let's just call him Kenneth, right? For example's sake. But he wrote this long explanation to me, and I show it to my students to show them an example of someone who genuinely has an OCD-like disorder. Now, the thing about Kenneth is that Kenneth has not been formally diagnosed, and I asked him, Kenneth, would you like me to recommend a psychiatrist for you to get a formal diagnosis if you feel you need help? He said, not really. It doesn't really affect him. So he still has his job. He's able to function adequately in society and stuff like that. So, it's not such a huge burden on him day by day. Which is a good thing. I mean, if he can live with it, so be it, right? And yeah, I mean, some people can live with it, right? These are small things, just tapping your leg and stuff like that. It's not going to, completely ruin your entire life. But and other people have far more severe OCD disorders, which prevents them from living a functional life, and that usually is the kind of the person that I would highly recommend to go and see a psychiatrist and to get the proper treatment, right? But Kenneth felt he was okay with it, and, so that's fine. So I can't officially say that he has OCD, right, because he's not officially been diagnosed. However, he certainly, just by reading what he wrote me, I genuinely believe that he does have some of the symptoms, right? The thoughts, the anxiety, the repetitive behaviors, the fact that he needs some kind of symmetry for his body and stuff like that. So it does fit the symptomology, right, of OCD. Okay. So obsessive thoughts, compulsive behaviors. What are some kinds of obsessive thoughts, typical obsessive thoughts that we have? Fear of deliberately harming yourself, right? You have this obsessive thought that you're going to hurt yourself in some way, right? Fear of harming others. Some people have these thoughts of harming others. Fear of illness or infection. This is a common one, right? People are afraid of germs everywhere. They're like, germs on the table, germs on the doorknob, germs on this, germs on that. And I actually had a lecturer who was like this. Again, I don't know if she actually had OCD, but she would refuse to open door handles with her bare hands. She would only touch it as long as she had a piece of tissue paper. So she'd always have a piece of tissue paper in her handbag. She'd take out the tissue paper, open the door handle with the tissue paper, and then she'd throw the tissue paper away. She would never be able. In fact, I remember there was once where she ran out of tissue paper and she had to stand outside class, and until one of us noticed her, and then we had to open the door for her because she refuses to touch door handles with her hand. Right? Absolutely. And she's very particular about hygiene and stuff like that. Again, she never told us whether she had OCD, but certainly she seemed to exhibit that fear of illness or infection, right? People also with obsessive thoughts tend to have a very strong desire for order and symmetry. Right? They want things to be in order, things to be symmetrical. Everything needs to be, it's on the left side, it must be on the right side the exact same way. Right? Similar to my friend Kenneth, if he has to tap his right leg, he has to tap right, left, right, and so on and so forth. Right? So he has his own obsessive need for that. Right? Now, what about the compulsive behavior? Right? So excessive hand washing is very common. Right? Now, just a note, the rows here don't correspond to each other. Right? So I'm not saying that if you have a fear of deliberately harming yourself, you're going to excessively hand wash. No, it could be any one of those fears, and then you result in hand washing. For example, a common hand washing obsession, a common obsession that's behind hand washing is germs, right? You think there are germs everywhere, so you're constantly washing your hands, right? Checking things repeatedly, which is what my friend Kenneth does, and my other friend Amanda also does that. She has that feeling where she's left the stove on and she always needs to check like 30, 40 times, right? Before she's finally convinced. So checking things repeatedly, that's a very common compulsive behavior, right? Putting things in order, making sure everything is arranged in a specific manner. Repeating certain words, repetitive counting, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, always counting in certain amounts, right? So all of these are compulsive behaviors, repetitive compulsive behaviors that people do to try and control their anxiety. Now, what's wrong, right? You might say, there's nothing wrong with washing my hands a lot of time. That's good. I mean, it's clean, right? It's hygienic. What about putting things in order? What if I work at a library? Everything has to be in order, right? I need to have the books in alphabetical order. I need to have this in order, right? What's wrong with checking something? If the stove is on, it's a good thing that I check 20 times, so I make sure that it's switched off, right? So what's wrong with this? Well, on the surface, if you can live with it, then I guess there's nothing wrong. But what if you live with other people? What if it affects their lives as well? What if you try to arrange everybody else's stuff around you? That would make them quite annoyed, right? If you touch their things without their permission. I have a friend. She has an aunt who exhibits some OCD symptoms as well. One of them being that before her aunt goes for a bath, her aunt needs to wash the entire bathroom and then has a bath, and then she washes the bathroom again. And if anything in that ritual is broken, she needs to start again from scratch. So there are times when other people are waiting to use the bathroom, and she's been in the bathroom for an hour or maybe even 2 hours, I've heard, right? Just because she has to make sure everything is following a particular order. And so that can really affect people around you, right? If everybody just has to wait on you just because you have a compulsive behavior in the toilet or in the bathroom. So yeah, even though yes, on one side you might say, it's nothing wrong with being clean. Yes, nothing wrong with being clean, but if it affects your daily life, that can be a problem, right? Okay, so let's look at the DSM, Obsessive Compulsive and Related Disorders. The DSM has several. You can look at the sections there. First one, OCD, right? Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. Second one is the BDD I talked about, body dysmorphic. And the third one is Hoarding Disorder, which I also mentioned that we're going to cover in your syllabus. The next one, trichotillomania, hair pulling disorder. Excoriation, skin picking disorder, substance medication, and so on and so forth, right? So we're going to focus on the first three for your syllabus. Now, here's an interesting question for you. If you look at my previous videos, you'll notice there's a video on impulse control disorder. Now, my question to you is this. What's the difference between OCD and ICD, right? Obsessive Compulsive Disorder and impulse control disorder. What do you think is the difference? Any idea? So after you've had some thought, they are rather similar, right? If you think about it, right? In a sense, you're looking at the difference between compulsion and impulsion, right? Impulsivity, right? In the ICD, compulsivity in the OCD. They're very similar, but there's a slight difference between them, right? Even though they both have, you could say obsessive compulsive disorder, people need to wash their hands constantly, right? If they feel that there's germs. Then in ICD, you have a similar behavior where people repetitively need to steal stuff, right? Kleptomaniacs, that they have this impulse to steal. Why do we call that an impulse? Why don't we call it a compulsion, right? Isn't it the same thing? Well, not exactly. So I found an article online which I think explains it quite well, understanding the differences between impulsivity and compulsivity. You can read this for yourself. It's at the website called www.thepsychiatrictimes.com. You can find it online. The article is quite long, so I'm just going to highlight two parts which I think explain it briefly. The first part I highlighted in red. that I'll read it out. Actions that are poorly conceived, prematurely expressed, unduly risky or inappropriate to the situation, and that often result in undesirable outcomes, or more simply put, a tendency to act prematurely and without foresight. That is what we refer to as impulsive, right? When we say someone is being impulsive, they're doing something without thinking in advance. They just go and do it, right? So a lot of times you find this when people are shopping online, especially, they just do impulsive buying, right? Oh, I see a computer, I don't really need it, I'm just going to buy it. Or I see this cute little plush toy, I don't really need it, I'm just going to buy it, right? So that's impulsivity. We don't think about the consequences in the future. We don't. It's all very premature, unduly risky, inappropriate, right? So when people don't think in advance, they end up doing things which are impulsive, right? So that's referring to impulsivity. For example, kleptomania as one of the impulse control disorders. They don't think about what they're doing, right? They just have this need to steal, and they just steal it without thinking about the consequences of what if they get caught, right? They just steal or set things on fire like a pyromaniac, right? In contrast, you can see the second part I've highlighted. In contrast, compulsivity refers to repetitive behaviors that are performed according to certain rules or in a stereotypical fashion. Compulsivity is a tendency to repeat the same, often purposeless acts which are sometimes associated with undesirable consequences. Impulsivity and compulsivity may be good as well. Okay. So anyway, moving on. What they're basically saying is compulsivity is more about repetitive behaviors that follow a certain type of rules. For example, I need to wash my hands in a specific way. Right, you saw my friend Kenneth earlier, right? He has a very specific way that he needs to tap his leg if he feels uncomfortable, right? Left to right to left, right to left, left to right, and so on and so forth, right? There's a very specific ritual, we often call these things rituals, that people with compulsions need to follow, right? Repetitive rituals, right? To help them ease their anxiety and tension. Whereas for the kleptomaniac, there's no ritual when it comes to stealing, right? It's just walking around, okay, something's there, just take it, right? That's impulsive. It's not compulsive, right? There's no ritual behind that, okay? So I hope that explains the difference between OCD and ICD. Let's look at one of the first disorders called the hoarding disorder, right? Hoarding. Hoarding means, to keep a lot of things in one place, okay? This refers to people who like to collect items, right? And they can't throw them away, right? Not because they shouldn't. They should actually throw these things away because they're usually useless, but they just can't bring themselves to do it, right? They feel like these items have a lot of sentimental value attached to them for some reason, right? So is there any value to these items? In actual fact, no. Most of these items are just rubbish, like things like rubbish, right? That have no meaning, no real value, right? But to the person hoarding them, there's a lot of attachment to these items, like as if they're so important that they just cannot seem to throw them away, right? So if people just collect items, it leaves their homes cluttered and very unhygienic, right? Now, you might not be able to imagine this as you're listening to this YouTube video. So I have a video example that I got from YouTube of an absolutely, which shows how disgusting and unhygienic a hoarding disorder, a person who lives in a house where they have a hoarding disorder, how terrible it looks like, right? It really is quite terrible, right? And relationships definitely affects everybody's relationship with you, right? How could you, be in a relationship with someone who collects mounds of rubbish in their house? Just item upon item upon item. How? You can't live like that. I don't know how. I watch the videos of people with hoarding disorder and I'm just in disbelief. I can't understand how people like that can live, okay? I'm not going to show this whole video. I'm just going to scroll through it so that my video doesn't get taken down. But so these were a group of volunteers, and they were trying to help this lady. She's in the blue jacket on the left. She's the hoarder. She's got a house behind her. It's full of stuff, right? And just look through. These are all the stuff that they're trying to throw away. Just look at the floor, right? Look. That's in the refrigerator. It's spoiled. She refuses to throw it away because she I don't know what she wants to do with it. It doesn't work. Switched off. Look at the floor. Just rubbish and dirt and like pizza with mold. They're wearing like full-on protective suits with masks and white color, that plastic suit to prevent any contamination. Look at that. They had a whole trailer at the back there that they just threw stuff. Just take a look at that. How could you live in a situation like that? I mean, it's hard to believe, but it happens. I mean, this actually happens, and she's not alone. There are many people who have. Look at that. He was gagging. He was like just trying to. I hope I'm not disturbing too many of the viewers, but you can skip past this part. But this is the reality of a hoarding disorder. That's why it's called a disorder, right? If you keep a few magazines at home, a few newspapers, that's fine, right? But this is a disorder, right? Although she can see, I don't know how she's lived all this life, and she can explain and try to justify the things, and she was trying to take them back out and say that no, this, as you can see, she's rummaging through the rubbish to try and take back her so-called valuable things. All of it's just rubbish, and these people are trying to help her, but she keeps, she's very stubbornly trying to save everything. You can find many videos like this online. It's really quite an eye-opener. But this is the reality of a person with a hoarding disorder. She doesn't think that there's anything wrong with it, right? Okay. Anyway, let's move on to a second disorder. So this is the BDD. Remember what it stands for? It stands for Body Dysmorphic Disorder, right? So this is a simple example of a picture that I found from Wikipedia Commons. So a skinny girl, she's looking at the mirror, and all she sees for some reason is a fat girl in front of her. Right? So people with body dysmorphic disorder, what happens is that they look at themselves in the mirror and they see imperfection after imperfection after imperfection, and they're just incapable of seeing themselves for who they truly are. Where there is no fat, they will see fat. Where there are no pimples, they will see pimples. Where there is nothing but a perfectly normal face looking at them, they see terrible ugliness, right? So and that's why we call it body dysmorphic disorder, right? So it's people who find problems with their own physical appearance. It's very slight. So they might just have one pimple, but they look at it as if it's 100 pimples, or if it's as if it's the size of Mount Everest, right? Or these faults on their body are just not obvious. A tiny wrinkle, and they think that they're 60, 70 years old, right? Usually it's on the skin, the face area, or the head area, right? That's usually where people often see it. But you can also see it in different parts of your body, and it's almost as if you're looking at someone else in the mirror. Even though it's reflecting you, your eyes somehow see it differently, right? Almost like that, right? So people have these obsessive thoughts, right? That there are imperfections on their body, and it creates a sense of strong anxiety. This results in compulsive behaviors, right? To try and control this anxiety. So they do a lot of mirror checking, right? These are the kinds of people who constantly look at themselves in the mirror, right? Nothing wrong with looking at yourself in the mirror a few times to appreciate how good looking you are. But, if you keep on doing it 100 times a day, there was a Greek mythology, a story about Narcissus. If you remember the story of Narcissus, he was very handsome and he couldn't stop looking at himself in the reflection in the water. I believe he died as well, isn't it? Looking at his reflection. I can't remember the exact story, but something along those lines. Anyway, excessive grooming, right? So there's nothing wrong with looking good and combing your hair and stuff, but if you do it excessively, right, it's not good, right? Comparing yourself with others, constantly comparing, and often feeling very bad about it as well, right? What else? Okay, so let's look at a case study, okay, by Rappaport in 1989. So Rappaport did a case study on a boy, 14 years of age. He had OCD, right? So he took 3 hours to take a shower, 2 hours to get dressed. Seems incredible, but I know people who are just like that, right? 5 hours just to get ready before he can go out, right? Very, very elaborate set of routines, right? He has to shower in a specific way. He has to get dressed in a very specific way, right? And after 2 years of this behavior, his mother sought help, right? So he left school for some time because he obviously could not go. If you need 5 hours to get ready to go to school, you'll never make it on time, right? So he had to leave school. In the hospital, he was given medication, behavioral therapy, and psychotherapy, right? So he went for medical help. He literally, because of all these rituals and problems, he only has one friend, which is unsurprising. How can you have positive social relationships with people, if it takes you 5 hours to get ready to go out the house, right? He used a drug called chlomipramine, right, which was initially successful. But after 1 year, unfortunately, he went into a relapse, right? He went back to his old behavior, right? So cases like this is pretty severe, even with treatment, it was tough, it's really tough. The obsessive thoughts, as we saw earlier, cause a lot of anxiety, and that anxiety results in compulsive behavior, right? Now, how do you measure OCD, right? We looked at the symptoms of OCD, the obsessive, the compulsive, and all that. How do you measure them, right? So you can use 2 scales, MOCI and the YBox. So let's look at the MOCI scale, MOCI. It's the Maudsley Obsessive Compulsive Inventory, right? Designed by Hodgson and Rachman, 1977. Now, actually, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if it's designed by them, but that's just a reference that I managed to find. 30 items, okay? You have to answer true or false. The score that you can give for each item is between 0 to 30, so we know it's a quantitative measure. Quick assessment tool, right? So it doesn't take too long to do. It's very easy, just true, false, true, false, true, false. I believe I have a picture of it. Okay, so yeah, this test for symptoms such as checking, washing, slowness, doubting, and so on. So you can look at the inventory here, right? Instructions. Please answer each question by putting a circle around the true or false. Following the question, there are no right or wrong answers and no trick questions. Work quickly and do not think too long about the exact meaning of the question. Sometimes you see that statement, right? Work quickly and don't take too long on each question. Reason being because oftentimes, I found this in my own experience as well, conducting studies and surveys. The understanding is that the first answer a person gives is usually the most truthful answer, right? The first answer that they give off the top of their head is the most honest. If I asked you, for example, what do you think about when I say fish, right? The first answer that came to mind, that's probably the most honest, right? It's the first thing that came to mind. So don't take too long to think about it, because if you think too long about it, you might try and second guess yourself and answer something differently. Right? So number one, I avoid using public telephones because of possible contamination, true or false. Right? I frequently get nasty thoughts and have difficulty in getting rid of them, true or false. I am more concerned than most people about honesty. I am often late because I can't seem to get everything on time. I don't worry unduly about contamination if I touch an animal, right? True or false. And you go on through the thing, and at the end of it, you can get a score between 0 to 30, right? Sorry, I think I made a mistake earlier. I said you can score between 0 to 30 for each item. No, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's a score between 0 to 30 at the end of the scale. So I guess either true is 1 or false is 2 or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the numerical value for true or false is. You can look up the original scale online and calculate it for yourself, right? Okay. There's another scale called the YBox, the Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale. If you remember carefully, YBox actually appeared in a previous video that I did. Anybody remember what the YBox was measuring? Previously, it measured gambling disorder. It was used to measure gambling disorder as well, right? So it can be adapted to certain disorders. Goodman et al. Did a semi-structured interview. Let me rephrase that. Goodman et al. Is the reference for the YBox scale. It is conducted using a semi-structured interview. So unlike a usual self-report where the person can do it by themselves, this one requires someone to do an interview with you, right? It takes about 30 minutes. It measures things like how much time, how much you resist something, how much distress you have for your your obsessions and your compulsions. 10 items on a 0 to 4 scale each, right? The maximum score can be 16 and above. Let me rephrase that. If you score 16 and above, you're within a clinical OCD range, right? So that means you definitely might get diagnosed with OCD, right? Again, this is not something you do on your own. You need to be diagnosed by a licensed clinician, right? Some of the obsessions that they cover are aggressive obsessions, contamination, sexual, hoarding, religious, symmetry, body focus, and other. Some of the compulsions that's covered in the scale is cleaning, washing, checking, repeating, counting, ordering, arranging, hoarding, other, right? So these are some of the obsessions and compulsions that are tested in the YBox scale. Here's an example. Let's read question number 1. Right? Time occupied by obsessive thoughts. How much of your time is occupied by obsessive thoughts? None. Less than 1 hour a day or occasional occurrence. 1 to 3 hours a day. Greater than 3. Up to 8. Greater than 8 hours a day or nearly constant occurrence. Right? So how many times a day do you get obsessive thoughts? Okay, so there are a variety of items. You can find the scale online, and I always tell my students for A2, please go and read up on each scale that's quoted in your syllabus, and make sure you read the whole scale, understand how the scale works, and memorize at least 1 to 2 items per scale. Okay. So let's talk about evaluating those measures. We always talk about measures in terms of things like validity. You want to know, is the scale valid? Is it measuring what it's meant to measure? A good way to check this is to just type online psychometric properties of the YBox scale, and then look for articles that talk about the validity of the scale. And you'll often find them saying things like concurrent validity, right? Face validity, content validity. So you can add those things in your essay questions when you want to evaluate, is the scale valid? Now, in general, all the scales that are mentioned in your syllabus are practically all valid, right? All of them are valid because they're commonly used by researchers. They're constantly updated and valid by other researchers, and so on and so forth. You just have to know the right words to use when you say this, right? The next thing you can check is reliability. Again, another psychometric property of scales is reliability. Is the scale reliable over time? If I give it to you on Monday and I give it to you next month and I give it the month after that, will it produce the same result? Right? So that's what we want to know. Call that reliability. Okay. Standardized. So are the scales standardized? Right. meaning, are they all in the same format and so on and so forth. Generally for self-report scales, they're all standardized, but occasionally for semi-structured interviews, right, or interviews which go along with the scales, they're not fully standardized because sometimes the interviewer may ask follow-up questions according to the format of the interview, right? If it's semi-structured, they can ask additional follow-up questions which may not be the same as the questions that they ask other people, right? Lastly, self-report, you always can comment about the advantages and the disadvantages of a self-report, right? Most scales are self-report. Some of them, of course, are accompanied by an interview. And I know either way, you can always, in psychology, I always tell my students, you can usually argue either way, right? If you want to argue for the advantage, you can. If you want to argue for the disadvantage, you also can. That it's not so black and white, right? When it comes to evaluation, it's usually about things that you can either argue the positive or the negative side, right? There is no hard and fast rule in most things when it comes to evaluating, right? In fact, it's more of a test of your critical thinking to be able to evaluate the good and the bad in one thing, right? Oftentimes we are very narrow-minded, right? We see something and we think, oh, that's all terrible. That's always going to be bad. No, to test yourself, take something that you think is bad and try and evaluate it and look for, a possible positive outlook on it, right? Anyway, let's move on to explanations of OCD. So there's biomedical, cognitive and behavioral, and psychodynamic. So biomedical is quite straightforward. It's always genetic or DNA and stuff like that. Matheson et al. Did a study with 1,406 participants, comprising of people with OCD and also those from the general population. They found, the understanding at the time was that genes, these two genes, PTPRD and SLITRK3, they are involved in regulating the synapses, right? Synapses are the spaces between neurons in your brain, right? And the gene DRD4 is involved in the uptake of dopamine, right? So if I remember correctly, let me just double check on this. Yeah, so what he did was he tried to, because people in his study obviously had OCD, and what he wanted to do is wanted to analyze these patients and identify if there were any genes that happened to be linked to OCD symptoms. Okay, so these were the genes that were identified, right? And these genes, when they're involved in regulating the synapses, and they seem to be linked to OCD symptoms. Okay, another one was the DRD4 gene as well, which is related to dopamine. Okay, and we've looked at dopamine before. Dopamine is the happy chemical, right? It can also affect people in other disorders as well, right? So these three genes, PTPRD, SLITKK3, and DRD4, they seem to be linked to OCD symptoms in people, right? So if that's true, can we say that OCD is caused by nature? Are people born with OCD? What do you think? Well, usually the case is no, it's not so straightforward. While there are certain incidences where you can, pick out certain genes which might lead people to OCD symptoms, that doesn't mean that every single person 100% falls into that category, right? Very rarely do we see a 100% genetic reason for any of the disorders that we study in our syllabus. Generally speaking, there is usually a genetic component and other things which trigger it, whether it's your cognition or your social environment or your behaviorism and so on, right? There's very rarely a 100% genetic cause for any particular disorder, okay? Some other biochemical things is to do with oxytocin, right? Oxytocin is called the love hormone, right? Why? Because it's involved with human trust and attachment, right? It's often a hormone that's secreted when mothers give birth to their children, because mothers have to, they're close with their baby, right? Their newborn. And oxytocin is often secreted, for parents in this manner to obviously draw parents closer to their children. Why? Because they need to protect their kids, right? So that's often seen. Okay, it's also shown to increase distrust and fear of certain stimuli, especially those that are threatening, which makes sense, right? If oxytocin wants to bring you closer to your loved ones, it also, in a sense, would want to protect you and your loved ones, right? So it can result in fear and distrust, especially if you encounter something that is threatening you and your loved ones. Okay. All right, so what's next? Yeah, so Leckman et al., they found that OCD types of behaviors were related to oxytocin dysfunction. So in people who had problems with their oxytocin, they seem to develop OCD behaviors, right? How did they find this out? They looked at cerebrospinal fluid and they compared patient accounts, right? So cerebral spinal fluid is the fluid in your spine, right, which can be extracted and looked at. And they compared this with patient behavior accounts, and they found that people who had problems, whether it's I don't remember. I don't think they actually mentioned whether it's like an excess or reduced amount of oxytocin. But whenever there's a problem with oxytocin in that patient, there seems to be a higher incidence of OCD behaviors, right? Is OCD just extreme? Let me think. What did I write about this? Okay, so what was suggested was that it's possible that OCD type behaviors are just at the extreme end of a normal range of behaviors that should be controlled by the hormone, which means that in normal circumstances, if oxytocin is functioning correctly, people will just behave in a normal way, right? And OCD is actually just sort of like a spectrum. That means OCD, if people were just a little bit less intense, right, then it would be fine. It would be perfectly acceptable. The problem is when there's something wrong with the oxytocin, they just do too much of it, right? Then it becomes excessive, and their behavior can be very, very difficult to handle, right? Let's look at another cause. So this is neurological. We're still under biomedical, right? So we looked at genetics, right? Some genes which are linked to OCD behaviors. We looked at biochemical, which is oxytocin, right? Oxytocin dysfunction is linked to it as well. Now we're looking at neurological. So we're looking at the brain structures, right? What are the abnormalities in the brain, right? In the brain structure, right? So there's a place in the brain, part of the brain called the basal ganglia, right? In studies of brain damaged patients, they found that this area of the brain is linked to obsessive thinking, right? A symptom of OCD, right? So the basal ganglia, the orbitofrontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate gyrus, okay, work together to send and check warning messages about threatening stimuli. Okay, so for example, if you see something that's threatening, there's a shark coming towards you, a lion is about to attack you, these areas in the brain, basal ganglia, orbitofrontal cortex, anterior cingulate gyrus, they will communicate with each other and receive these messages and check, okay, is this a threatening stimuli? Yes, it is. Okay, quickly go into fight or flight mode, something like that. Or is this just a butterfly? Okay, this is not scary, it's not threatening. Okay, I don't have to worry, right? So they're supposed to regulate this system in the brain of threatening and non-threatening stimuli and warning us. But if there's a problem, right, if there's something that's not right in this system, right, that's not working the way it should, right, that means that the basal ganglia will start to continue receiving messages saying something is wrong, something is wrong, something is wrong, right, a warning, right. By right, your brain is supposed to automatically regulate itself and say that, okay, this is bad, this is okay, I don't have to worry, this is worrisome, whatever, right, it's supposed to regulate that. If there's a problem, then you're constantly thinking that something is wrong, something is wrong, something is wrong, right? And what do people like that end up doing? They end up having very obsessive thoughts, right? Okay, I didn't lock the door. Oh my gosh, I don't think I locked the door. Oh my gosh, the whole world is going to come to an end if I don't lock the door. I have to go back and lock the door, right? So they go and do their compulsive behavior to handle the anxiety, right? So this could be one of the explanations for OCD as well. Okay. Now, let's look at cognitive and behavioral, right? So this has to do with our thoughts. Cognitive obsessions, according to Rackman in 1977, people have obsessions because of faulty reasoning, right? So everything to do with cognition is to do with our thinking. For example, they believe that hands are covered in germs. Now, in actual fact, your hands, your face, and everything, they are covered in germs, right? Germs, viruses, bacteria, lots of different things are living, millions and millions of them are living on your skin. Your whole body has its own microbiome, which is actually normal. It's just that you have a faulty reasoning by imagining things, and thinking and blowing it out of proportion, right? And oftentimes that this faulty reasoning worsens under stress. So if you're in a stressful situation, like a pandemic, a global, worldwide pandemic, like what we're going through right now, your obsessions might become worse. Right? They might worsen under stress. That you believe everything, not just your hands are covered in germs, everything and everyone is covered in germs, right? And that results in your compulsive behaviors to help reduce your thoughts and reduce your anxiety. For example, if I believe my hands are covered in germs, I wash my hands, right? In a particular ritual. And this acts as a negative and a positive reinforcer. Now, negative positive reinforcement is basically this. Negative reinforcement is, okay, so let me rephrase that. Reinforcement or reinforcers are always about strengthening a desirable behavior, right? In under normal circumstances. For example, a very simple one is let me think of a positive reinforcement example. If you have a child and you tell your child, okay, I want you to do your homework, and they finish doing their homework, and you give them an ice cream. That's a positive reinforcement. Why it's positive? Because you added something to them, right? You gave them something, and it's a reinforcement because it's a reward for their good behavior of doing their homework, right? And you want to reinforce that desirable behavior. Negative reinforcement is similar, but negative indicates that you're taking something away. But reinforcement means you are continuing to, strengthen a behavior. In this case, compulsive behaviors are not actually desirable, right? We don't actually want people to continue doing their compulsive behaviors. But because they do these compulsive behaviors, what happens? It reduces the anxiety, right? So the negative reinforcer means negative here is taking something away. So what am I taking away? I'm taking away my anxiety, and by doing that, I feel better, right? So that's the reinforcement part, right? So by taking away something bad, I'm reinforcing the compulsive behavior. Oh my gosh, I think my hands are covered in germs. Okay, let me wash my hands 10 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, thank God, I got rid of all the germs. Okay, I should always wash my hands like this 10 times. Then I'll get rid of the germs, right? So can you see? It's negative because it takes away anxiety. But it's it's a reinforcer because it continues to tell people that, okay, I need to wash my hands 10 times to make this happen, right? On the other hand, there's also positive reinforcer, right? Positive means you're adding something, right? What are you adding? In this case, you are adding I guess you could say in this way, like by doing the washing of hands, you're adding, in that sense, quote unquote. I know that's not the best explanation, but you're doing something in the sense to get rid of the germs, and then you feel good about it, right? So from one perspective, it's getting rid of the anxiety. From the positive perspective, it's just adding something, which is, you're giving yourself the reward of getting rid of the germs, right? So that can also be construed as a reinforcement. If you didn't understand that, just remember that compulsive behaviors help to reduce the anxiety. Okay, let's go to psychodynamics. So psychodynamic comes from our dear friend, anybody remember? Sigmund Freud, right? The good old Sigmund Freud. Now, psychodynamic is all about internal conflict between the id versus the ego. Remember the id and ego, right? If you don't remember, just check out my previous video before this, which was on, what was it on? Was it impulse control disorder? I think it was impulse control disorder. But anyway, on one of those other videos, I talk about the id and the ego, right? I talk about id and ego. And so what happened? Oh, sorry, it was on anxiety disorder, right? Anxiety disorder. I talked about the id and the ego and the super ego, right? So if you don't know, you can go and Google it up online and find out what is Freud's theory on id, ego, super ego. If you remember, id is all about pleasure, right? It's like the little devil on your shoulder telling you, yeah, just do it, right? And then the super ego is the angel on the side of your shoulder, on the other side, and the angel telling you, no, this is not right, you need to make sure you do only what is right. And the ego is in between. It's you trying to balance between the id and the super ego, right? So Freud also believed in something known as psychosexual development, right? Sounds fancy. I will explain it in the next slide. For now, you just have to keep in mind that he was focused on the anal stage. I don't know why my students always laugh when I say the anal stage, but when you think about it from a psychological perspective, it's not that funny, right? So also can happen, this happens when there's a lot of tension between parent and child, right? So the anal stage is a stage of development that a child goes through, right, when they're growing up. And if there's a lot of tension between a parent and a child in this stage, and I'll explain why on the next slide, this can result in OCD-like behaviors, right? A child tries to be in control, right? And then by soiling themselves. Okay, this is where it becomes a little bit difficult to explain. The anal stage, right, in psychosexual development of a child is all about the child understanding that they can be in control, right? Reason being because as babies, you defecate and you urinate without much control, right? You don't control yourself as a baby, and your parents just have to clean up after you, right? But as you grow as a child, you learn how to be what is known as potty trained, right? You learn to control your bowel movements, your bladder, right? And also your anus to try and control yourself. If you feel like urinating, you wait until you can find a toilet, then you urinate, right? At the same time, children try to express this control, right? By instead of just randomly urinating or defecating whenever they want, they might try to control when they soil themselves, right? So, and children are just experimenting and they're trying to learn and trying to figure out the world, right? So this is not unusual. It happens, right? The problem is the child fears punishment, right? So if a child soils itself, what's going to happen, right? If a child just takes a dump in the house, in the middle of the house, what are the parents going to do? They're obviously going to get angry. They're going to scold and punish the child, right? And so the child begins to fear punishment. And so what they do is they hold it in. They hold it in to try and regain control. Right? They keep holding it, holding it, holding it. And this results in a conflict. And that's why we get these words like anal expulsive and anal retentive, right? Anal expulsive is when children try to rebel and just try and solve themselves whenever they want. Anal retentive is when children who are scolded and borderline just abused by their parents when they do these kind of bad behaviors, right? And they don't know any better. They're just children and experimenting. So they try to hold it in. That's why they have the word retentive there, right? And the expulsive and retentive kind of indicates the kind of personality characteristics that these children grow up to develop, right? So if you say someone is anal expulsive, Freud would say that this person is very wild, very random. Like they might just have a sudden outburst. Like, hey, what's going on? You know what I mean? They're very expulsive, right? In that sense, a very random, loud, and they just lash out, right? Anal retentive people are the opposite, right? They keep trying to hold everything in, right? They're the ones that try and make everything perfect. Everything's in order. Everything must follow. Everything has to follow the rules, right? So anal retentive people are more towards the OCD behavior of everything must be in order, everything must have symmetry, and so on and so forth, right? The id's obsessive thoughts disturb the rational ego, right? So the thoughts from the id, right? Everything must be in order. Everything must be in order. Everything. If the pencil is out of alignment, the whole universe is going to tip out of balance, and this affects the rational ego, right? The ego tries to be rational and tries to control it, but it's being affected, right? What are the other stages? There are a lot of other stages as well. I'll go through it briefly using this illustration. This is wonderful. I mean, honestly, the best psychology-based illustrations come from this website called verywellmind.com. Honestly, the best. Like really, I hats off to the whole team, and I hope they don't have an issue with me using their pictures as part of education, right, for fair use. You can look at the Freud's psychosexual stages here. So the first one on the top left-hand corner is known as the oral stage. This is from birth to 1 year. The erogenous zone is the mouth. Erogenous here basically just means the area of the body which is the focus of pleasure, right? So this is common in babies. Babies put everything in their mouth, right? If you've ever had a child or you've seen a baby crawling around, they want to put anything and everything in their mouth. That's why babies, there's always these things on toys and stuff like that says like choking hazard from the ages of 0 to 2, something like that. So only an older child should play with it, right? Because older children know you shouldn't just put anything in your mouth, right? But babies don't know. That's how they explore the world. They put stuff in their mouth, right? It starts with the mother's breast, and then it goes to a bottle, and then they're just picking up stuff and putting it in. So they're exploring their world through their mouth, right? Next comes the anal stage, from ages of 1 to 3 years of age. The erogenous zone here is the bowel and bladder control, right? As I said earlier, as children begin to grow up, they learn to control their body functions, right? Their bowel movements and so on. And if they're punished for it, then they become, that can affect them, right? If they don't control it properly. Next comes the phallic stages from the years 3 to 6 years of age. The erogenous zone here is the genitals, right? So what happens here is that children are not sexually active, but rather they're beginning to explore their body. They're realizing that, hey, guys and girls look different. I've got a penis, a girl has a vagina, right? They're noticing these differences. They're exploring and understanding their body better. This is also where you see the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex. You can watch my previous video on anxiety disorders to see what I explain about that and look up online. And then it goes into the latent stage, right, from ages of 6 to puberty. So what happens here is it says libido is inactive. Libido is sexual energy, right, how much you are sexually drawn towards someone, right? And what happens here is that usually children are not sexually prompted or sexually, for lack of a better term, sexually energetic, right? Children don't go around looking for sex, right? That only happens when a child hits puberty, right, around the ages of 12, 13. That's when it normally happens, right? So children growing up from 6 to 10 years of age are usually just playing around, having fun, enjoying their lives, right? They don't really think about their bodies and sex, right? But once they hit puberty, then you go into the genital stage, which is then about puberty all the way until the day you die, right? For maturing sexual interest, usually in the opposite partner, or for people with homosexual orientations in the same sex partner, and so on and so forth, right? But this is the stage where your life begins to blossom later in life from puberty onwards, right? Throughout each stages, if anything goes wrong, then you'll have issues, right? Lots and lots of issues. I honestly can't remember because I'm not a huge fan of the psychosexual stages, but you can read more about it online, right? So there's a lot more in-depth explanation and so on and so forth. Okay? Now, we come to evaluating explanations. So when we mentioned the neurological explanation, was it a good explanation? Biochemical, genetics, cognitive, psychodynamic. What can we say about these explanations? Well, firstly, genetics is often objective, right? Because we use, things like DNA testing, scientific methods to measure people's genes, right? So it's lab-based, objective, very very laboratory-based. So that's good. It's always usually very valid. And because it's a very valid measure, it's often replicable, right? However, genetics is very limited, right? Just looking at a person's genes, 1 or 2 or 3 genes, we've got so many genes. Our genes interact in ways that people don't even understand sometimes, right? So it's a very limited view. Doesn't give a complete picture of a human being, right? Right, when you study people's genes and stuff, you don't even ask them, what was your life growing up like? What experience did you go to? They don't care, right? It's very limited. So biochemical is also objective, lab-based, but can it be cause and effect, right? Just if I think that oxytocin, will it cause in every circumstance a person to develop OCD? Not necessarily, right? So oftentimes people get, people often get so hooked on genetic and biochemical causes, and they think that it's cause and effect. Right? They think that, just because I found this one gene, it means you're definitely going to get this. Not necessarily. There are a lot of other environmental factors as well, right? Neurological, unfortunately, lacks generalizability, right? Because it's very specific to people with that particular issue. Cognitive and behavioral, mostly based on self-report, right? Which can be a good thing, can be a bad thing, right? It's good because you can do it in your own private time, but it's also bad because it's not really a scientific measurement, right? Also because people can lie if they feel uncomfortable. It's good because, it reflects personal experience, right? So you understand what experience this person has gone through and get a full, comprehensive picture. But it's also prone to bias, right? People often lie, right? People lie all the time, right? They want to make themselves look good. So that can be a problem. Psychodynamic theory, unfortunately, has no empirical support, right? Freud's theories, id, ego, superego, there's no scientific evidence to support it. The psychosexual stages as well, he didn't conduct any experiments to back up his theories, right? They're just theories, right? It's also very difficult to measure the variables, right? How do you measure the id, ego, and superego? They're just abstract concepts. You can't really measure them, right? So that makes it difficult to use this as scientific evidence. Cause and effect, again, very difficult to establish, right? You can't really have a proper experiment. You can't really have an IV and DV. You can't even measure them properly, right? So now, let's look at treatments for OCD, last but not the least. Biomedical, CBT, ERP. So biomedical, some quite straightforward by Sumro et al. So we're going to do it something to do biology. But instead of actually doing, like injecting something or studying people's blood and so on, what Sumro et al. Did was they did a research design quantitative meta-analysis. Now, we looked at meta-analysis before in one of my previous videos. A meta-analysis is when you take a lot of other studies, many studies, and you combine the results of these studies together to do an overview. Right? You want to see if all of these studies are combined together. Let's look at all the data from all these studies. Do they all say the same thing? Right? We're combining them together. So the aim of Sumro's meta-analysis was to see the effectiveness of SSRIs versus placebos. Who remembers what SSRIs are? They stand for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, right? We saw that in one of our previous videos in abnormal psychology, right? Now, here's the thing. SSRIs are used to treat OCD disorder, right? Versus placebo, which one is more effective, right? So he compared, I'm sorry, I don't know whether it's a he or she, but Sumro et al. Compared 17 studies with 3,097 participants in total. So that's a huge sample size. They didn't actually sample them. They just counted the number of people in all these 17 different studies. Right? And what were the results? The results showed that SSRIs are indeed more effective than placebos, right? Which is what, is good. It's good. It means SSRIs do work, right? How do they work? Well, what SSRIs do, they reduce symptom severity. So they reduce, I believe, if I remember correctly, they reduce the anxiety that people feel. Right? Yeah, so they reduce the anxiety, and by reducing the anxiety in a person, you end up reducing symptoms, right? Because if you don't feel anxious about the world, you don't need to do any compulsive behaviors. That's the wonderful thing, right? The less anxiety you feel, the less compulsion you need to do, right? Because you don't have any anxiety to resolve. Let's move on to the next study. This is a CBT study by Lavelle et al. The research design was a randomized control trial, right? So there's a control group, randomized, so people were allocated into either experimental or control randomly, which is always the best way to do it. The IV was delivery of CBT, right? How is the CBT? CBT again stands for cognitive behavioral therapy, right? If you want to know and understand it better, it's not fully covered in your syllabus, so you should read about it online, right? The levels were either face-to-face or telephone, right? So they would be delivering CBT-based therapy, either face-to-face with these patients or over the telephone, right? The sample size was 72 participants. Measures included the YBox Scale, which we saw earlier, the BDI, right, the Beck's Depression Inventory, client satisfaction questionnaire, and so on. Please make sure you also read all the original studies to understand them in depth. Results were that both treatments were effective. So it doesn't matter whether you call people on the telephone and give them CBT therapy over the telephone, or it doesn't matter whether you sit down with them face-to-face and do it. Both seem to have a positive effect, right? And in situations where, like now, where people are suffering at home from COVID-19 and stuff like that, it's good because this research shows that you can just call people up. You don't have to be physically with them. Call them up and you'll be able to, conduct the CBT therapy and have effective results. That's good, right? Again, for each study that you look at in your syllabus, make sure you evaluate and think about the research design. Is randomized control trial a good research design? Is it a bad research design? What about the levels? Having levels means that it's what kind of a research method is this? Research design. It is a between subjects, right? Between subjects. Is there a benefit to having between subjects? Is there a disadvantage? What do you think, right? Measures that were used, are they valid measures? Are they reliable measures? What are the psychometric properties that you can find out online, right? Last but not the least is exposure and response prevention, ERP for short, right? This was by Lemkool et al. It was a case study on a boy named Jason who was 12 years old, right? Now, Jason was a bit unfortunate because he had OCD symptoms as well as ASD. ASD stands for Autism Spectrum Disorder, right? So he had OCD, Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, and autism, right? But he had high functioning autism. So high functioning autism basically means that your IQ is average. However, you still have other autistic characteristics, right? So you can usually, the high functioning suggests that, you can function pretty well in society, but you still have you still have other problems to deal with, perhaps social issues, right? Because of the autism. So Jason would spend hours on rituals, and he would always feel a lot of anxiety if he did not complete his rituals. The steps of exposure and response prevention is this. First step is to gather information about the client and understand everything about them. Secondly is to conduct the ERP itself. And lastly is a generalization and relapse training, right? So Jason went for 10 or 50-minute sessions over 16 weeks for treatment. The problem with Jason was that because of his autism, he had difficulty imagining pretend situations. And this can happen, right? If you remember in our AS syllabus, remember the study that we looked at, which features autism? It was Baron-Cohen's study, right? Baron-Cohen talked about how people with autism have a lower theory of mind, right? The theory of mind, the ability to understand their mind and the minds of others is very low. And so this can be a problem because people with this issue, with autism, may have difficulty imagining scenarios, right? They can't visualize and imagine another person's mind. They may also have problems imagining stuff, right? So he had difficulty imagining pretend situations, right? They obviously want to do treatment where he has to imagine something, a lot of difficulty with that, so they had to modify to suit him, right? He would learn to use coping statements in the face of anxiety by saying things like, I know nothing bad will happen, right? So he had to learn how to cope. And what's this? Increasing exposure. So the part of the exposure in the exposure and response prevention is to increasingly expose the patient to triggering stimuli, right? So if he tells us that these are the things that trigger him and make him feel anxious, we should expose him to it and teach him to prevent all these compulsive responses from happening, right? To slow them down, right? So I put modify there because they had to modify it slightly to suit his ASD, right? It's quite sad, unfortunately, that people with autism are also sometimes misdiagnosed because sometimes autistic tendencies tend to be very similar to obsessive compulsive tendencies, right? Things that autistic children do may look like OCD, right? Sometimes they may have both, sometimes they may have either or, but the person diagnosing them has to be accurate, right? In order to make sure that they get the right therapy, right? Habituated. So habituated habituated is the same as, similar to the word desensitize, right? You want to get him used to all these triggering stimuli. That's why they introduce triggering stimuli to him that makes him anxious, and they get him to be habituated towards it. Habituated means that once he sees it again after a few times, he doesn't feel as anxious anymore. And if I remember correctly, the results were positive, right? They managed to help reduce it. So again, it's a case study. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It's up to you to decide. Jason was 12 years old. He had OCD and ACD. What do you think about the sample? Do you think it's generalizable? is quite niche, right? Not many people have OCD and ASD, right? So hard to generalize. Difficulty imagining pretend situation. This may have reduced the effectiveness of therapy, right? So yeah, that's basically it. We've covered all the general information for OCD disorders and related disorders. Once again, thank you for listening. I believe this is the last chapter for the abnormal psychology, and I'll see what other future videos I'm going to upload. I think I have to cover the so in my syllabus I teach abnormal psychology as well as organizational psychology. So I'll be uploading those videos when I have the time. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Ross. You can follow me on my social media at MagicRoss7. That's my Instagram. Please help me out by liking, commenting, and subscribing to my videos and my channel so that it can help me grow. And if you feel like donating, you're more than welcome to donate. If you feel my videos have helped you in some way, it's not compulsory, it's completely voluntary, right? Also, feel free to contact me if you want my bank details. You can message me via email, or you can put a comment in the YouTube section if you rather transfer via bank or via transfer, right? Thank you very much, everybody, and I'll see you soon.